Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to paint this plant shelf. This is based off a miniature by Hannah Lemon. When I first came across this photo, I thought it was completely real until I looked closer and also checked out her Instagram. These are all hand sculpted leaves. It looks incredibly real. I mean, the colors and the textures are just so detailed and amazing. And I probably spent a little bit too long staring at her post, but yeah, check out her Instagram. Her work is amazing. And on the left is the shelf that she made. I really like the cute shape and the contrast of the dark wood and the vibrant leaves, so I'm going to make a version of it to fit my small sketchbook. The first thing that I want to draw is the shelf. I want to make sure that the composition is centered in the middle of the page, and I know I want to add some taller plants on either side of the shelf. My sketchbook is also fairly short, so I'm going to make up my own measurement to fit the size that I have. I'm not going to make the shelf as tall as her original. I think there are 5 levels to hers, but I'm just going to make mine 4 levels, and I'm not really going to measure equally since I quite like the idea of having some levels of the shelf taller than others so I can vary the plants that I paint later on. Just like her composition though, I like the idea of having different plants at the bottom in different heights, so that's something that I'm going to apply as well. I'm fairly happy with the positioning of the shelf and also the height, so now I'm just going to add the plants themselves. For the plants, I just kind of made it up as I go. I didn't really follow the reference image, but I want these plants to complement the main shelf. Sometimes when it's a bit hard to get ideas for different plants, I like to search tropical plants for the leaf shapes and even the shapes for the pots, or you can also include your favorite plants that you might have at home for this composition. Since I live in Jakarta, I see a lot of tropical plants when I go for my afternoon walks with my dog, so I try to also remember plants that we pass by day to day. As I'm drawing these plants, I want them to interact with the shelves as well, so some of them may overlap. This will help loosen the composition instead of having one plant in one specific place without it going outside of the border. It's okay if there's some random lines going through your leaves. I'm going to ignore them for now and erase them later on. You can see that some of the pots are slightly floating. That's because I didn't draw out the surface of the shelf, which will mostly be in shadow later on, so I'm going to indicate them later as I paint. For the plants on the side of the roofs, I'm going to make them very tiny, so I made a succulent on the left and these really tiny leaves on the right hand side. I felt like the composition on the left looks a bit too empty, so I'm going to add a box that a pot of plant can sit on to give it a little bit more height. By the way, if you don't want to do any of the sketching and want to get straight to painting, I'll have the outline in my coffee shop. I'm just going to change the plant here since it was too similar to the one at the bottom. And next I'm going to go through the colors before painting. This is Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Cobalt Blue by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Booker's Green by Cotman, Vermilion by Holbein, and Jaune Brilliant by Holbein. I'm also going to use Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins and also outline using my Snowman pen. I'm going to start by painting the plants, and here on my palette I've activated Booker's Green and Hansa Yellow Medium, which I'm going to mix up for this first plant. For color variations, I like to play around with the ratio, so here I added more Hansa Yellow Medium to make a lighter green. And for the succulent on the left, I used a mix of Jaune Brilliant with Vermilion to make a pink, and I'm going to pair this with a little bit of green. Because the space is very small, I'm just going to paint this loosely and outline it later on. For this muted dark green, I used Hooker's Green as the main green, then added Cobalt Blue and a little bit of Vermilion to mute the color. Then with more Hooker's Green, you can see that the color is a little bit more vibrant, and if you add more Hansa Yellow, the color will be brighter. For these leaves, there's a little bit of space for color variation, so I decided to add a darker green for the center or the midribs. For this next one, I used a mix of Hooker's Green with Cobalt Blue and Vermilion, and you can see that the color is quite dark, so I used a thin consistency first and used a thicker consistency to add a little bit of texture detail. To paint on the detail, it helps if the base color is completely dry, so you can dry it off with a hair dryer and use a smaller brush to add on the details for better control. I want to introduce a different type of leaf for this one. I want the leaf to be pink and green. I started with a light consistency of pink, and that's from Jaune Brilliant and Vermilion. Then I painted lines directed at the center using the dark green from before with a little bit of yellow green, but I left the border as pink. For this one at the bottom, I'm going to use a light consistency of the yellow-green. Once the surface is completely dry, I'm going to use Vermilion in a medium to light consistency to paint lines directed at the center. Next, for the snake plant, I'm going to use a yellow-green. This is from Hooker's Green and Hansa Yellow. I'm using a light to medium consistency to paint the whole base color. Then I use a dark green. This has more Hooker's Green in the mix to separate the curled area on the inside. And then using a thicker consistency of the same green, I'm going to add the pattern. Then for better contrast, I use a mix of Hooker's Green and burnt umber to paint the inside of the curled parts as well as darken some of the pattern. For these large leaves on the left, I'm just going to keep it simple by using a mix of Hooker's Green and Hansa Yellow. And I'm going to darken the parts of the leaves which are curled in as they're bunching together, and for this I just added Vermilion into the mix, and I'm also using a slightly thicker consistency. Then I'm going to soften the blend using a clean damp brush. Once the surface is more or less dry, I'm going to add lines in the middle of the leaves as the midribs. Next, I'm going to use some dark green color to paint some of the stems on the leaves. Now I'm going to move on to the leaves on the tree on the right hand side, and for this I'm using a mix of Hooker's Green and Cobalt Blue, and I'm just going to paint all of the leaves as the base color. Once I'm done, then with a thicker consistency, I'm going to add the midribs following the curvature of where the leaves are directed. I'm also going to add the veins using the same color, and just like before, I want to slightly curve the veins to follow the curvature of these leaves so it doesn't look flat. As for the stems and the branches, I'm going to use a mix of Cobalt Blue and burnt umber with a little bit of yellow ochre. At the moment, the leaves look fairly dull, so I'm going to introduce a darker value, and for this I'm using a mix of Vermilion, Cobalt Blue, and Hooker's Green. And I'm just going to paint the darker values in some areas of the leaves so they can stand out a bit more. If I end up darkening the whole leaf, I'm just going to use a slightly thicker consistency to paint the extra details for the veins and the midribs. After this, I'm going to move on to the shelf, and for the main brown, I'm going to use a mix of burnt umber and vermilion for this rich reddish brown. I'm going to work section by section, and I really like the lighting on this reference image, so I'm going to follow the areas of the darker values. After painting the base color, I like to follow it up using a darker value, and for this I just added the dark green mixture from the previous leaf we painted mixed into the reddish brown. I'm going to paint the main lines first and follow the reference image. As you can see, the light is coming from the left, which means the color will be lighter on the left hand side for these lines compared to the right hand side. So for the horizontal lines, we will be able to see a transition between those two values, starting with the lighter reddish brown on the left to the darker brown on the right hand side. And for this, I like to work while the paint is still damp, so they create a softer transition. Once the base color is completely dried, the color is a little bit too light for my liking, so I'm going to increase the vibrancy by going over those areas again. Underneath the roof, I like to use a darker, more muted brown, and for this I'm using a mix of burnt umber with cobalt blue. For the stool at the bottom, I'm going to use a different tone of brown to separate it from the shelf, so I'm using a mix of vermilion and yellow ochre. Just like the shelf, I want the left side of the stool to be lighter than the right, so I'm using a slightly thinner consistency on the left and a darker value on the right. For the top face, I'm also using a light consistency to separate it from the front face. Then for the box at the back, I added more yellow ochre so you can see that it's less reddish compared to the stool. Next, I'm going to paint the pots, and I'm just going to mix up some random colors for it. I want the colors to be fairly neutral and light so it will still stand out against the dark background later on. I like using this gray mix, which is from burnt umber and cobalt blue. I first use a really light consistency, then while the surface is still slightly damp, I added a thicker consistency of cobalt blue. You can add the thicker consistency in random places for different designs. I'm going to pair this up with some terracotta pots, and for this I just use a mix of burnt umber with vermilion and yellow ochre, and I'm going to play around with the ratio as well as the consistencies for different tones. And you can also add different designs using the wet on wet or the wet on dry techniques if you want to add some pattern on the pot as well. Whenever the leaves are drooping down, make sure you paint carefully around the edges. For this larger pot on the right, I want to make sure to separate the top rim and the bottom of the pot, so I used a lighter consistency for the top and add a thicker consistency as shadow below it. As for the soil, I'm going to use burnt umber and cobalt blue again in a really thick consistency. I use much more burnt umber in the ratio though, so the color is warmer. By the way, for this composition, if you are painting at the same scale that I am, which is really small, it can be a bit difficult to control using the same brush, so feel free to switch it up and use a smaller one whenever you need to. Next, I'm going to paint the back of the shelf as well as the surface of the shelf, and I'm starting with the burnt umber and cobalt blue mixture at the bottom, so it's very dark, but I'm using a medium to light consistency. Then for the background, I'm going to use more burnt umber and a thicker consistency. I'm going to work per section since it's fairly difficult and it takes a lot of time to paint around the edges of these plants. And while the surface is still damp, I added a darker value which has more cobalt blue in the ratio, but I'm still using a really thick consistency. This time, because we're painting the back of the shelf, the light will be covered by the top of the shelf, so the lighter part will be on the right hand side. The base of the shelf looks too faded, so I'm just going to go over it again using the same mixture. I'm going to do the same thing for this part of the background as well. Again, I'm working in sections because I like to create the gradual transition from the darker value to the light value while the surface is still damp. This way, the damp surface can help me with how the paint travel and mix with each other. Just like before, on the left side, I'm using the darker value with more cobalt blue in the mixture and a very thick consistency. And I'm just going to continue to paint the back of the shelf for the rest of the painting. To add a bit more form to the roof, I'm going to add a line using the same mixture in a medium consistency at the bottom on the left hand side and a darker value on the top right hand side. At the moment, everything looks kind of blurry because the edges are not that clean, so I'm going to clean some of them out using bleed-proof white on the edges of the shelf. I'm not going to do this and outline every single item though, because we're going to outline using an ink pen later. Instead, I'm going to work on the cast shadow as well as the floor so the composition doesn't look like it's floating. I'm going to make the frame of the floor kind of wavy and loose, and in terms of the color, I'm using the browns that I've already pre-mixed on my palette with a different color ratio and variation as well, so it doesn't look flat. Now, while the surface is still slightly damp, I'm going to use a light consistency mix of burnt umber and cobalt blue for the dark muted brown, and I'm using this to paint some of the cast shadow, and I'm just letting the color flow and expand to the wet surface. For the last bit of the painting, I'm going to add a bit more depth to these leaves, and then I'm going to outline the shelf as well as the plants to give them a cleaner definition. I'm using my thinnest ink pen to do this so the lines can be very sharp but delicate at the same time. I also chose black because the background is quite dark, so I feel like the black won't be too harsh against everything else that I've painted. However, if you want a lighter outline, you can also use an ink pen in the color sepia or brown, or you can also use colored pencils. So from here, I'm just going to outline all of the plants, the shelf, and the pots. Lastly, I'm going to add some extra white lines to the shelf, and that's basically it for this painting. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more tutorials like this. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links and the link to the outline will be in the description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!